Well, welcome back to our Bible study through the book of James. In this session, we'll be in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. To give you some quick context leading up to James chapter 4, verses 13, James is talking about humility and why we should pursue humility, and God exalts the humble, but he resists the proud. And with that in mind, he says this in James chapter 4, verse 13. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such a city, and spend a year there and do business and make a profit." Now, James here is likely talking to the merchant class who could actually do these things. So in that time period, not everybody could travel around and do business in other places, but those that could would essentially, like we do today. So I think this verse is very relevant to an American context. All of us can kind of travel and visit places. We have automobiles, we can fly in planes, we can go places, and we have a lot of flexibility relative to really most of human history. And so while this verse is particularly talking to the merchant class, it has highly relevance to us today. And the point that James is going to make here can still be applied as broadly as possible. And so why should we not be so stuck on our decisions and our plans? Well, here's what he says in verse 14. He says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. For you are like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Now, the problem that James is addressing here is not that doing business is bad or that earning an income or a profit is bad. Neither of those things are bad at all. The problem, rather, has to do with not considering God in our plans. In other words, the problem, like James has been saying in a lot of the book of James, is a lack of humility. He's saying you are planning like you know what will happen, and that displays a lack of wisdom, because wisdom for James is kind of a skill in living. In other words, wisdom is not just intellectual, it is revealed, and how we live actually determines if we are wise. Now, this is a lot of, I think, relevance today, especially in 2020 due to the pandemic, where we've all faced the tension of having our plans changed. And I think one of the difficulties, particularly in our context, is not just that the pandemic disrupted our normal lives, is that we are not used to have to actually live day by day or week by week. We're used to being able to plan and do whatever we want, but the pandemic is showing us what is always true, that we are not in control, and God is. And so we need to heed what James is saying here, humble ourselves, make plans, but then ultimately give them to God and follow where he leads. And so because our lives are like a vapor and then vanish, as he says in verse 14, here's what we should do. In light of that, verse 15, he says this: "Instead, you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that," right? If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Now, here's the thing. The phrase "Lord willing" is something we hear often today. It can be somewhat empty, right? We can say it so often that it cannot really mean anything. It kind of be like this empty phrase. And so what James is saying here is he's not just saying that you need to verbally say things when you're making plans. Like, we're going to do this, and if God says it's okay, then we'll do it. It's not so much about verbal affirmation as it is a heart posture. It's that as we go about and make our plans and decide what we want to do we have a heart of still being willing and flexible to do what the Lord leads us? Yes, it is wise to plan and to direct and to try to pursue certain things, but are we planning with humility, or are we planning with an arrogant self-assurance that we are going to do whatever we say we are going to do no matter what? Right? And we need to have humility. And here's why. Here's what he says, verse 16. He says, "But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil." Right? All such boasting is evil. The problem here is that pride and a lack of humility is the problem. It's not planning. It is a pride and a lack of humility in our planning. Remember that James in the book of James is addressing believers here. And so he's telling believers to resist the earthly, the cultural temptation that we all have that makes us think that we are in more control than we are. Again, particularly in our American context today, when we're used to being able to do what we want to do, order the things that we want to order, make the schedules that we want to make, and travel the places that we want to travel, we need to have humility in these things and ultimately consider the Lord as we plan what we might do. Right? All such boasting is evil. Right? Making plans as if we're in control and God does not matter and what he might want for us does not matter is a problem. And so in verse 17, the last verse we'll read, he says this: So it is a sin to know the good and yet not do it. In other words, what James is saying here is that sin is not just something that you do, right? Sin can also be something that you don't do, right? It can be something that you do, but it can also be something that you don't do. He said, you don't consider the Lord. This isn't good. And so you and I can go about and make decisions and maybe not be harmful or hateful or disparaging to other people. And we might pat ourselves on the back and say, look, I didn't do any bad things. But we also have to consider, what about the things that we are not doing? Are some of the things that we're not doing actually sinful? In this case, not considering the Lord. In other words, kind of the main idea of what we see happening in James chapter 4, verse 13 through 18 is this: consider the Lord. That is what he's saying. As you plan, as you go, as you do, and as you live, make plans, pursue things, have dreams, but consider the Lord. Do not let our arrogance come over us as we walk and live in a way that God does not matter, that we are somehow in control. Consider the Lord in what we do, and to James, that is living in wisdom.